name is Whitney Lambert.
And I'm Darien, Lozon.
And we're from Cornerstone University. We're both seniors, and our mentor is Dr. Rob Keys. And we are going to be we studied the influence of habitat on breeding grassland birds. So why did we choose grassland birds? Over the past about 30 years, the Midwest has had a dramatic decline in bird species. In this graph, the grasslands are the lowest, have the lowest number of decreasing species compared to all other biomes in which birds were measured. And about 80% of these grasslands were converted to other uses, such as agriculture, urbanization, cities going up. So grasslands have just been decreasing in general. And two species specifically that have felt the effects of this are the Henslow sparrow and the grasshopper sparrow. And the grasshopper sparrow has just had a declining population in general. And the Henslow sparrow is an endangered species in Michigan.
So why are we looking at Pierce Cedar Creek Institute? Recently, over the past couple of years, Pierce Cedar Creek Institute has taken out hedgerows from the prairies that are surrounding the visitor center and the education building in order to make the area more contiguous and to make the habitat more hospitable for these birds. However, the grassland bird populations are not increasing as these people have, I guess, expected. And we're wondering why this might be, so we're looking to further understand what management practices we should have going on at Pierce Cedar Creek and how exactly we can increase these population numbers.
So the specific question that we're looking at are what habitat characteristics, landscape features, and management practices at each of our study locations act as attractors or detriments to grassland birds.
And in order to answer this question, we looked at different areas within southwest lower Michigan, in Kent, and Barry counties. And we looked at 5 sites specifically, and we separated them into 10 fields that we could study. And what's really interesting about the areas that we decided to study is that they were both private and public lands, and they represented different management types. So we could potentially look at the diversity of these different management types and which management type we could potentially have going on at Pierce Cedar Creek Institute. And the bottom right corner shows something that we did to ensure randomization when we surveyed these areas. We separated them into smaller areas so we could choose one per section when we visited the site each week. And this is an overall estimate of which management types are represented. And PCCI is an example of a restored prairie. And a restored prairie is an area where it is under a strict schedule in order to get it burned. So within the past year, Pierce Cedar Creek Institute has had prescribed burning. And we're just looking at this in order to see how the diversity is being affected with this management type. And conservation reserve programs are agricultural areas that are put into a land contract for 10 to 15 years and they cannot undergo any agricultural use at all. And mixed management in our instance is an active hay field along with some prescribed burning in some areas in which there is no management at all. And our mowed area, which is represented by the Gerald R. Ford International Airport, they like to have the area mowed around the fence area for a buffer zone, and they like to they like to mow it annually. And this year, they mowed it after the breeding season.
So our studies conducted bird abundance and biodiversity, and we did this through bird surveys. And we would do 10-minute point counts at each of our sites. We would go out with a GPS into the field, which had points determined already, randomized points, and we would go to that point in the field, and we would stand there for about 5 minutes as an acclimation period, just that the birds got used to us being there in our presence, and we weren't disturbing any of their natural calling during their breeding season. And then after those 5 minutes, we would stand for 10 minutes and listen to all the birds around us within a 50-meter radius. And as we did this, we recorded in our data sheets the different target species that we heard. As we just saw on the last slide, there was about 5 to 7 sections that our fields were each split into, and we had one random point from each of those sections surveyed. And we did this for 7 weeks. So overall, we got an even distribution of points surveyed from each field. And we also took into account territory sizes of the birds. So right here we have a meadowlark, an eastern meadowlark, and they have a fairly large territory size. So when we we're standing at our point count, if we hear one eastern meadowlark and then hear one a little bit, maybe 5 minutes later, it likely could be the same bird that flew to a different spot. However, the Henslow sparrow has a very small territory size, so it wouldn't be uncommon to hear maybe 3 or 4 of them, all different birds within the same point count.
And along with birds, we also looked at habitat characteristics, and one of the things that we looked at specifically was litter depth. So litter depth essentially is the accumulation of dead vegetation over the course of the field. And we looked at this specifically because a lot of the birds that we're studying are ground nesters. So it is very important to have this litter in order to have a successful brooding season. And vegetative density was also something that we looked at, and we used a rubble pole in order to figure that. And the rubble pole is pictured in the middle. And we also took into account dominant vegetation within each of the areas that we surveyed. And also, along with landscape features, we used a lot of ArcGIS for this aspect, and we took a 1 kilometer radius from the center of each of our fields in order to, get a determination of what types of landscapes are being represented here and how they could potentially affect the diversity in these areas. And we used national land cover maps in order to determine that. And we looked at percent edge, also along with the percent of landscape that is surrounding the areas.
So we looked at the habitat characteristics, land management techniques, and now we're going to look at the results that came from this. And we have a graph here of the number of grassland birds per point. And this compares them to the management types. And here we have a much greater amount of birds per point for the mowed fields, which this would be the airport. And the Conservation Reserve Program field also had a fairly decent number of birds per point, where mixed management and the restored prairie, which is Pierce Cedar Creek's property, those have a much lower number of birds per point. We also looked at species richness, so this is just the number of species that can be found at each field. And again, the mowed field had the greatest number of species richness, and the Conservation Reserve Program also, that field also had a pretty decent number of species found there. We also looked at diversity within the management types, and we did this using the Shannon-Meyer Diversity Index. And again, we see that the mowed field had the greatest number of diversity of species, and this is the mean diversity. And the Conservation Reserve Program also had a decent number of diversity. The mowed fields were actually had a magnitude 182% greater than the restored prairie, which is Pierce's field, and it was 111% greater than the Conservation Reserve field. So in general, there's a much greater magnitude in general diversity that comes from the mowed fields.
I mentioned before that we looked at litter depth, vegetation density, and the dominant vegetation. However, litter depth and the vegetative density didn't really have much bearing in regards to having a model for how diversity is being affected. So we looked at dominant vegetation type, and our model showed that fescue of the 3 top species had a greater correlation in regards to the diversity of the birds in the areas. And fescue, compared to big bluestem and goldenrods, had 124% greater magnitude and 78% greater magnitude, respectively, which is very significant statistically. So we could potentially conclude that fescue would encourage biodiversity within these areas. Along with dominant vegetation, we also looked at landscape factors, and our model showed that urbanization is encouraging biodiversity within these areas surrounding these fields that we're studying and being directly adjacent to the areas. And we can see through the R-squared values that they are very highly correlated in regards to diversity in these areas.
So we looked at the habitat characteristics, landscape features, and management practices of each of these that we originally described in our first question. So how do we answer them? We found that fescue was the most highly correlated grass to grassland bird biodiversity, and that urban areas have been the best model for landscape factors, and that the mode management also encourages the greatest biodiversity. So you might be thinking, why would urban be the greatest for landscape factor for encouraging biodiversity? And a lot of our urban area comes from the airport. The runway is considered urban, and that whole area and kind of around that is urban with roads. And so it depends on the type of urban that we're talking about. It's not saying that you're going to find more grassland birds near a big city. It's saying that we were surveying by an open urban area, and there was a lot of roads along some of our fields. And we did find that the Henslow sparrows specifically tended to be found and heard towards the edges of our fields near the roads, which was an interesting observation that we made. And so applying this to Pierce Cedar Creek, we noticed that a lot of Pierce's fields are filled with big bluestem, which is not a persistent grass. It dries off completely during the winter, and then this layer is found in the summer, again in the spring when the snow melts, but it completely dies off. Where fescue is a persistent grass, and so some of that's still available in the spring, and we think that this correlation may have to do with Pierce's fields not having as many persistent grasses, and maybe further look into that as to how the persistent grasses may be encouraging or discouraging biodiversity in the fields at Pierce.
As Whitney mentioned, we can have a little bit of further research in regards to persistent grasses and how they could potentially affect diversity within these fields. Also, we could look at edge effects. For instance, I guess our poster child for this kind of topic is the Gerald R. Ford International Airport. We have the north and south sections that we separated, and the northern section is much more narrow, and it had a greater biodiversity when we did Shannon Weiner. So it would be interesting to look to see how edge effects could potentially affect the diversity within these fields. Also, we could look at airport conservation, because there isn't much known in regards to diversity in these airport grasslands. So it's really interesting to get a start and try to figure out what exactly is going on in these areas that are constricted, as you can see with the no trespassing sign. Very scary. So, yes.
So we'd just like to thank all these people for helping us out with this research. It wouldn't have been possible without them. So we're greatly thankful for all their support. Are there any questions?
So do you think it was really the knowing that the management was the system, or the fact that they have those big no trespassing people out at the airport? Because it really, your data says PCCI should stop all prairie restoration, just mow.
Right. I think the mowing was definitely a factor for their management techniques. I don't think it was completely mowing, though, that was encouraging all the diversity there. It's definitely something to consider, but I think the vegetation and just the amount of space that they had kind of restricted just to, there's nothing else going on in those fields. So I think it was kind of a combination of factors. Yeah.
Kind of related to that, I was curious going to, do you know if there's any other literature on mowing specifically to manage for grassland birds? Is that one study at all?
A little bit.
I believe airport conservation is just something like entirely different that we could look more into. I'm pretty sure maybe there is more literature out there, but we just haven't found it yet, I guess. So yeah, it's definitely possible.
I also just wondering how maybe age of the field could affect this, because I would imagine the airport has had that as an open field for quite a long period of time. You said the conservation was a 10-year commitment. How long have they had that out of agriculture? And then we know that PCI property is, fairly recently the hedgerows have been removed. So we do have very different time frames here.
I believe it's something interesting to note is that the CRP fields that we looked at were right down the road at the corner of Broadway and Cloverdale. And the CRP field had also been recently burned along when PCCI was burned. So it's really interesting to take into consideration that both of them were burned at the same time. However, we're seeing different forms of diversity in these different fields given the composition of these fields.
How long has it been out of agriculture?
I'm not certain. Yes.
I was wondering about the total number of species or the variety of grassland bird species that you're looking at. I think, because part of it, I think about, for instance, in your diversity measurements, presumably there's brown-headed cowbirds in that mix, right? Which is not really probably the objective of your work. And so, you know, I'm just wondering how you classify the grassland birds and the spectrum of those, because, you know, if you're truly interested in Henslow's sparrow and that sort of thing, then your results might be different as opposed to if a bulk of what you're getting on brown-headed cowbirds with, which, you know, is also
Yeah.
a grassland bird.
Brown-headed cowbirds we didn't look into. We actually initially thought of looking into brood parasitism, but our nest surveys didn't really succeed in what we were trying to do. But we had 6 target species. We were mainly looking at henslows, grasshopper, savanna, and field sparrows, along with bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks.
Oh,
So yeah, those were our target species that we were surveying.
We originally had a couple other ones too that we were going to look at, but they just didn't appear in the field, so we didn't include those. Any?
I was just curious what target species you found so that sites.
We actually found quite a few henslows at the farm right down, soy farm right down in the corner of Cloverdale and Broadway. That was the most common one there, and we also found a lot of henslows at the airport. At Pierce Cedar Creek here and Jones Farm, which is about 3 miles away, we found mainly field sparrows and song sparrows. Yes.
Whitney and Darien, first of all, I wanted to just make an announcement that your project is a great example of how bird researchers can do really relevant, important work that helps modify the stewardship practices at Pierce Cedar Creek, so thank you very much for that. But I also want to mention that as a person responsible for removing the hedgerows, I am more than a little disappointed in your results. Maybe not what I wanted to hear, but it's a great important step to realize what we're doing and the impact that we're having. But we talked quite a bit about mowing and the impacts that has on maybe being preferred management practice for these birds. What about grazing? Did you consider maybe how native grazers might be introduced into a system like this to help out the bird populations?
We did not really look into that, but there definitely is literature for that
We have
because
some literature like that has talked about that a little bit, but since we didn't have that actually as like a way, as we didn't have it in the field we could go to actually study that from, we just didn't include it in our results. But it'd be something to consider.
That's enough for future research.
Mm-hmm.
That's good to